In this video, I am going to show you how I am changing a solid hand wheel on this Singer model 6616 to a spoked hand wheel, and I am installing a hand crank on the unit instead of the motor that's on there now. Now this machine is going in a cabinet table, and it may end up having a motor on it for its final configuration. But right now it has a motor and a foot pedal on it that the wiring we don't feel is really safe. And while I'm waiting for another motor to get here, I'm going to set it up with a hand crank and a spoked hand wheel so you can see how to do that when you find a machine like this. This again is a 6616. And a lot of the old machines that you might come across might come with wiring that either the insulation is wearing away or disintegrating, or there might be another reason where the motor just isn't safe, and maybe instead of rewiring it or putting a new motor on it, you might want to think about putting a hand crank on it. It's a wonderful way to use a sewing machine. It's quite unusual, and it's great. You never need power except your own arm power. And let me just show you what I have here to do this with. Over here you see a spoked hand wheel, and this one actually came off of another 1900s or an early model 66. That is one side, and that's the other side. This is a reproduction hand crank. It's sometimes difficult to find original hand cranks. This is a reproduction hand crank made for Singer machines. I don't think it'll fit other machines. I think this is made specifically for Singer. And then with the spoked hand wheel came two items. That's a washer that has 3 tabs on it, and this is a round knob that will screw on the end of the screw into the end of the shaft on the machine. This is called a clutch wheel, and I would imagine this is called the clutch wheel washer. And the washer has to be put on there a certain way so that when you loosen the screw on the clutch wheel, you can then, well, you have to loosen, I'll show you when we get to it, but you have to loosen the clutch wheel in order to disengage the motor. Let me start again. You loosen the clutch wheel to disengage the needle so that you can wind a bobbin. And you use this screw right here to tighten the way that it's set up against the washer once you get all of this assembled with the hand wheel. I'll explain it a little better when we get to that point. But this is what you need. You need a spoked hand wheel, a clutch wheel washer, and a hand crank. The first thing you have to do is take the motor off. Now on this Singer model, and on most Singer models that'll have a motor, if not all of the early models, and this only pertains to models that have an external motor that can be removed. There's a bracket here, a motor bracket is here, and it's held onto the machine by one screw, which is called the motor mounting bolt, and it mounts underneath the hand wheel right here. So you take that one screw out, and you'll be removing the bracket. The motor will come right off, and in this case all of the wires go right to the motor, so all of this will come off in one piece. Now I have loosened the bolt on the motor with a screwdriver, and I'm just going to show you that just by removing it there, you disconnect the belt from the motor pulley, the belt pulley on the motor, and the whole motor assembly comes right off with the foot pedal, and I'm just going to put that on the floor. Then you have to take the belt off the machine, and I'll show you that. Here's the belt. It was in the belt groove. You have to make sure your bobbin winder is up. You could actually leave it like that until you get the solid hand wheel off, or you can take it off now and you just have to get it around the bobbin winder and off of there. And I did go ahead and take the belt off now just by moving it underneath. I pulled it underneath the bobbin tire on the bobbin winder. So now what you're looking at is a solid hand wheel, and of course the machine already has a clutch wheel assembly on here. And to take this off, and this is where I got ahead of myself a few minutes ago, you want to loosen the screw right here, and that will allow you to unscrew. This is a set screw, and it'll allow you to remove this whole thing, to unscrew it from the shaft. It's different from loosening it. Right now I could loosen it to disengage the needle, but I need to loosen this set screw in order to remove it. And as you take this off, the clutch washer is going to be sitting on the shaft a certain way. And if possible, you want to remember exactly how it's sitting there. Because the way the tabs, some of the tabs on the washer are bent, and they sit on the shaft a certain way. And if, after you get this done, your clutch wheel assembly doesn't loosen to disengage the needle, it's because the washer is not sitting in there correctly. So let me go ahead and loosen the set screw. This clutch wheel assembly is in better condition than the other one that came with the spoked hand wheel. So I'm going to use this one again, also because it's the original. So I'm going to loosen the set screw, I'm going to remove this, and if I do it right, I'll try to show you exactly how that clutch washer is sitting there. I turned the machine around a little bit so you could see in better light. I have this on a work stand right now. The machine itself is out of the cabinet and sitting on a work stand because it's easier for me to do it that way, but I'll also show you what it looks like when it goes back in the cabinet. I've loosened the set screw, and I can now loosen, and it is still difficult to do it with one hand, but I can loosen the clutch wheel. And what you want to do is be careful that you don't lose that set screw. And when I get to the point where this is going to come right off the shaft, the washer could drop. So you want to try and prevent that if you can. So I'm just going a little slow. And you'll know you have the set screw out far enough if the needle doesn't try to move when you do this. Now see how that's sitting there? So here are the tabs, and it's sitting on that shaft a certain way, and you want to try to remember that. Or what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it off, and I'm going to move it down like that, and put it down in the same position, and leave it there until I need it again. So when I pick it up, it should go right back up the same way. I would pick it up and place it right up there. So you don't want to lose your set screw from your clutch wheel, and you want to keep the clutch washer in the right position. So now you're at the point where the hand wheel comes right off. Just like that. Now if you have an old machine that needs cleaning or oiling or anything like that, you can do that now while you have the hand wheel off. And the next step is putting the spoked hand wheel on. Now there are replacement reproduction hand wheels that are made. You can use them. A lot of times they work, as long as they're for the right machine that you're working on. As long as wherever you buy it from, it says it's for a singer if you're doing it for a singer. I like the old original hand wheels. So the spoked hand wheel is going to go on the same place that you had the solid hand wheel. And it's going to look like that. And now I'm going to pick that clutch washer up and I'm going to place it back in the same position that it came off in. And it just sits on the end. So you have to be careful you don't drop it. And then you'll see the inside of the shaft is threaded and the clutch wheel itself is threaded. So now I'm going to carefully screw this back on. And I'm going to put the camera down because I don't want to just knock that the washer and knock it out of place. So you just want to do it straight the first time. So let me put the camera down. Now I did get it started. It's not tightened all the way, and I still don't want to knock that clutch washer out of position. So I'm going to very carefully tighten it. And when you see that it's tight like that, now I'm going to take my screwdriver and I'm going to tighten that set screw. And if everything lined up correctly and stayed the way that I had it when I took it apart, then tightening this little set screw should have everything working correctly. So now let's assume that. And what I would do now is loosen this to disengage the needle. On a Singer machine, you always turn the hand wheel toward the front. And the needle is not engaged. And I'm turning the hand wheel. So far, so good. Now I'm going to tighten that back up again. And there goes the needle. You always want fabric underneath your needle when you're testing it, so that you're not making empty stitches in the bobbin area. And that is how you put a spoked hand wheel on a previously motorized machine. That's it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the hand crank right here where the motor was mounted before. And let me go grab the hand crank and the bolt, and I'll show you how that goes on there. Now I've got 3 bolts in my hand, and two of them are the same length, and the one in the middle is a little longer. The one on the left was too short to mount a motor correctly, so I had it in my pocket. The one in the middle that is longer came off of a motor mounting, and the one on the right that is a little bit shorter goes with the hand crank that I'm using, which actually I had mounted on a treadle machine, a Model 66 treadle machine. So when you buy a hand crank, you may get a shorter bolt like that, but if you can save the original motor bolt, which is the slightly longer one, that's good too, because you never know, you might want to put a motor back on this in some way. So I have to keep my bolts separate here. Let me just put those 2 down. This is the one that came with the hand crank. And that on the right of that is the one that was on the original motor. Now this is what the hand crank looks like. And it's going to mount like this. This bolt hole right there is going to fit underneath the hand wheel, same way that the motor was. So you take the longest bolt that you have, and that's a better view. You're going to fit those 2 parts together, and you're going to just screw the bolt into the hole under the hand wheel. So now the hand crank is installed on there. You can see down here. It looks a little crooked, so I will loosen it again and straighten that up. There's a little ridge on the machine that is built up, and there's an indentation in the hand crank. So obviously I missed that a little bit, and I'm going to loosen that up and set it again. But the way that this is now disengaged. Here's a view of the hand crank on the side. And this area right here is disengaged because it's sticking out this way. To engage the hand crank, you just fold that in like that, click it in between the spokes of the hand wheel. But let me tighten. I can't do anything until I line the whole hand crank up again, because otherwise it's just going to not go smoothly. And you can see that that is sitting much better now, and it's actually on there correctly. And what I'm going to do, bring that arm up and just fold this in between the spokes like that. Now you crank backwards, and the hand wheel goes forward. And that's all that's involved with making a machine a hand crank. That's on a Singer 66, an antique Singer Model 66, that's it. You now have a hand crank. And now what I'll do is move the table I have it on over toward the cabinet, and I'll show you some of the issues that come up when you're putting it in a cabinet, and I'll show you what it looks like from the front. Now there's the machine from the front. It's still in the base on the work table that I was using it on. I'm going to hand crank, and it works. But if you'll notice, all of a sudden the machine is much longer, especially with the hand crank set up like that and engaged. The machine itself is much longer. Now, I'm going to show you how you put one of these machines into a cabinet. I've talked about it in other videos. I think I've done it in a couple of them. But let me show you what's on the back of the machine here. They're not in focus, but right here and right here are two holes. And these are the hinge pin holes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the machine up with one arm and hold it over the hole of the cabinet it has to go into. And I'm going to, line the hinge pins up with those two holes and slide the machine onto the hinges. This is the cabinet that this machine is going into. These are the two hinge pins. There's one and there's one. And you're going to see me pick up the machine and kind of hover over those hinge pins until I get the machine to slide back onto them evenly. And you have to check that you have the set screws on the underneath of the machine a little bit loosened before you try this, before you start to do this, because the set screws are going, once the machine is on there, are going to tighten up against the hinge pin. And so if they're too tight before you do this, the hinge pin won't go in the hole on the back of the machine. Now these machines are heavy, and if you put it down on the cabinet while you're doing this, you just want to be careful that you don't scratch or damage the cabinet you're doing it with. So the set screws are loose. You have to have good footing with your feet so you don't lose your balance. These weigh about 30 pounds, and it's always interesting getting one of these into a cabinet. And what you have to do is be careful that it goes on both pins at the same time. And if you don't have the set screws equally loosened, then you have to jiggle everything. Okay. Now from the view above, and I know the light is poor, there's very little space between the hinge and the machine on both sides. I don't have a spare light over here. So now, let me point out, see, so the machine is now sitting in the cabinet, but what I have to do is pick it up, use a screwdriver to tighten the set screws underneath the machine. And I think the cabinet is far enough away from the wall. You want to tip the machine back like that, and just in front of where the hinge pins went in will be a small set screw in front of each hinge pin, and your standard Singer screwdriver or a similar size screwdriver, you can feel around and just tighten that up. These two set screws are what hold the machine in place when it's lowered into a cabinet. So it's very important that you tighten them up and you get them as tight as they can go. Sometimes it takes a minute or two to get the screwdriver in the slot right. But it has to be done before you do anything else with the machine. And if you were to lower a machine into a cabinet without having the set screws tightened, the machine would fall right off the hinges and down onto the floor, and if there's any wooden apron or skirt guard underneath the machine, that would obviously be broken as the machine went crashing down. Now some of them, you think they're tight and they're not. So you really have to make sure, like this one, the one on the right tightened up very well, very easily. The one on the left is going a little bit more, with a little bit more resistance. But I want to make sure I have it tight. Okay, I think that's tight. And then to test it, what you want to do is leave the machine tilted up a little bit and try to pull it off of there. And see that? That's moving on the left-hand side. So let me tighten that screw up. Now here's what the machine looks like, set up as a hand crank and installed in the cabinet the way it would be. And you'll notice over here that the hand crank extends too far to the right to stay on the machine when it goes down into a cabinet. So if I were to convert this machine right now, I would use it like this and leave the machine up all the time out of the cabinet. But if you are someone who wants to lower the machine into the cabinet and store it that way, then each time you lowered the machine, the hand crank would have to come off. It's just that one screw under the hand wheel, so it's really not a big deal. And it makes a beautiful machine that you don't need any power for, and it's a wonderful way to sew with these antique machines. Very easy to convert an electric machine to a hand crank machine as long as you have the correct spoked hand wheel and a hand crank made for the machine you're doing it with. Most often would be Singers, as far as I know. By the way, this is a 1947 16, excuse me. It has back tack on it, which is reverse, so that down is forward. And I'm going to crank to the right. The wheel will move to the front. I'm moving that lever up to do back tack. And that noise you hear is the hand crank assembly right here. The crank likes to make noise. Some of them do. So now I'm putting the lever back down again to go forward for straight stitching. And there you go. I've taken the hand crank assembly off, and here's the hand crank and the bolt to hold it in place. And I want you to look again at the clearance here. The wheel is just going to make it down into that cabinet. The spoked hand wheels are bigger than the solid hand wheels. So if you have an electric machine in a specific cabinet, then what you want to do is, once you put a spoked hand wheel on there, you want to make sure it's going to lower into your cabinet. It should, in most cabinets made for Singer full-size bed machines, it should. But this is going to be really close. With the hand crank on it, because it's a reproduction hand crank, this machine was originally extra. When hand crank machines were made originally as hand cranks, they came in special cases that were longer and accommodated the hand crank. But because this is a conversion, the cabinet that it came with, and that I think was original to it, is only long enough to accommodate a solid hand wheel, really. So even with the hand crank off, you have to make sure you have enough clearance to get the wheel down into the cabinet. Now, for some reason, that left hinge pin set screw didn't tighten up right. So I'm going to put the camera down again, and I'm going to hold the machine as I show you how it goes down into the cabinet. But I already know that left set screw is loose, so I have to figure that out before I install the machine permanently in any way. But I'll show you how you would lower it down into the cabinet, and we'll watch and see how that clearance is on the hand wheel. I have the machine tilted back. I have the lip section of this cabinet toward the front and out of the way, and I'm just going to go ahead and lower this down. I don't think I can get the camera over by the hand wheel end. I already know my thread gets in the way, so I'll just move that out of the way. And let me just show you. There's the clearance. So I actually do have, well, about almost a half an inch. I'm holding the machine with one hand because that left screw is loose. And I'm going to bring it back up because I don't want it to slip. It would have been dangerous for me if the right set screw, being tight, wasn't strong enough to hold the machine, and if the whole thing started to slip, I would have had to let go, or I would have had a broken arm. So those set screws are important, and I can't overstress them. I was always worried when I had cats that my cats would be walking underneath a cabinet and a machine would decide to fall out. So it's something that you want to take care to tighten correctly, and right now this one isn't tightened correctly, so I'm not going to do any more with lowering it. But you could see that I had about a half an inch of clearance for the spoked hand wheel when the machine was going down into the cabinet. So if I were to leave this as a hand crank machine and use it as a hand crank, if I did decide to lower it down into the cabinet, I would only have to take the hand crank assembly off. And in fact, this table, this is the Singer long table. This table has a nice big drawer section on the left, and the hand crank might even fit in there. It's bigger than an attachment drawer per se. So this would work as a hand crank with the caveat that the crank itself would have to be taken off before the machine was lowered down into the cabinet. And one final note, I keep all the original parts. The solid hand wheel, the motor, the foot pedal. I keep all of that together, usually in a small box. And wherever the machine goes, usually that goes with it. If there's something wrong with the motor, if the motor isn't safe or something like that, then obviously you don't need to keep the motor if you've got your machine as a hand crank. But unless there's some kind of a safety hazard, I like to keep the original, at least the original hand wheel with the machine, because you never know if you'd like to change it back to an electric. That's the left hinge pin for this machine. And you wouldn't believe it, but when I actually went to remove the machine, I couldn't yank it off of there. So this actually was tight, but the hinge was moving. Now see that? I haven't seen these kind of hinges before, and I don't know if that means the hinge is broken or if it's supposed to be on a movable pivot like that. I mean, usually the whole thing moves down. So when I was pulling the machine and that was moving, and I was afraid the machine was going to fall, it was actually the hinge moving out. So let's move over here, and this one doesn't do that. Now, I don't know why, because the machine does go down all the way. I've had the machine down a couple of times. Oh, there it goes. So this one, you see? This is why you really have to look at everything on here. Now what I'm going to do, I don't think I have a cabinet that has similar hinges. But what this means, and this one's easier to see in the better light, this means that that whole machine being suspended in the lowered position is depending on the strength of this part of the hinge, not the screws or bolts that might hold the hinge into the wood, but this movable part down here. So that's why, so my set screw was tight enough, but this hinge moving like that was looser, more loose than this one. And so what it looked like to me was that the right side was tight and the left wasn't. So that's good to know, except what I'm going to do with a better light is really inspect these hinges and make sure that none of this is corroded or rusted. Now this table is also from 1947, so it shouldn't be rusted or corroded because the rest of the table doesn't seem to be. But I'm going to take the extra step of checking those because, like I said, you never know when a cat's going to walk under your sewing machine cabinet.